you get to work with me because I finished this at just before 9 o'clock this morning, and I hadn't eaten or taken a shower. So I haven't gone through it a second time, so you get to hear me practice. Let's see, Mark, is it up on the screen yet? Let's see if it works. You know, I am extremely grateful. I came in this morning and there was a hint that maybe the projectors weren't working, and I guess one isn't. So apparently while we were on vacation, one of the projectors gave out. And then trying to connect, because this thing is connected wirelessly and it wasn't working. I worked for about 15 minutes prior to Sabbath school and it didn't connect. So I'm grateful that it is. You know, if I would have anticipated all the little ones, I would have probably oriented my children's story a little differently, but I am going to have a children's feature. But before I do that, this is our key text. So if I get too boring and you want to take a siesta here in church, just remember this text and you'll get the whole thing. The Lord hears his people when they call to him for help. He rescues them from all their troubles. So, at this time, I need all the children from about age 2 to 18. And I need the children to come up because I've got some things over here that I need help with. So especially I need Jack and Aurea. They're two that I have designated jobs for. Now, Jack, you are going to be the construction manager. That means you get to tell people what to do. And Aurea, you're the distribution manager. That means that I need you to move something. But before I do that, could I have maybe Leah and Micaiah, if you could take this brown blanket and kind of spread it on the platform here. Spread it out. Now, Aurea, your job is distribution manager. So I need you to take these buckets of rock and bring them up here onto the stage. Can you do that? Now, Aurea, I need them up here. Do you think you can accomplish that? Try the other one. Oh, she got it off the ground. So, Aurea, there's probably a lot of things in life that you can't do. Can you drive a car? No. Who do you depend on to drive the car? Your mom or dad, or there's somebody else in your family that can drive. And so when you can't do something, what do? You ask them for help. Well, you're the distribution manager, so maybe you could ask for some help. I need those up on the stage. And if Leah can't do that, ooh, that's a tough. Okay, they're up on the stage. Now, we need another one, but you probably ought to pick on someone else. Who's feeling strong? There's a Mr. Mike over there. He could do it. Okay, help Andrew. Yep, bring it up here. There we go.
All right.
Okay, now it's Jack's turn. Remember, what is your title? You're the construction manager. So what you need to do is tell them to dump the rocks out onto the blanket, and then I want you to have them build a monument out of 12 stones. Do you think you could do that? Stack up the stones? Now, you don't have to do all the work because you're the manager, but you got a whole bunch of helpers here. So come up on stage, dump the rocks out of the buckets, and let's see if we can build a monument. Yeah, just make sure you don't smack little hands. You guys can help him. Come on up. Because there's some big rocks in there. Okay, here we'll get rid of the bucket. We'll put that over here. Okay, now all of your job is to follow the directions of Jack and build a monument out of 12 stones. Yep, that's... Now, will you tell them to do it? Okay, I want you to build up the rocks, put them on top of each other, and make a 12-stone monument. Yep.
All right, 12-stone monument.
12 stones.
Let's do it.
You see, the children of Israel had been wandering in the desert for 40 years, and they had come to the promised land, but there was a big barrier. It was called the Jordan River. Now, the Jordan River today is a measly little muddy river. Has anybody been there? There's one person. I know the Sakais have been there, but they're not here today. I think they're in Canada. It's not a very big river, and it doesn't flow very well. They take a lot of water for irrigation and that sort of thing. But in the days of the children of Israel, they had a major hurdle, and that was a very swollen river. It was springtime, so you had snow melt. Yeah, make sure they all stack up there real good. So they had snow melt plus the rains of the spring, and the river was overflowing its banks. Yep, you're good. Thank you for all your help, guys. We now have a 12-stone monument. And there was several 100,000 people and their animals that needed to cross the Jordan River. Now, if we could take all the water out of the Columbia River and the thousands of people that live in Vancouver had to cross over into Portland, what would it be like? There'd be a lot of mud. In fact, if you had thousands of people going in the same area, it would churn it all up, and it'd be a mess, and you might not even be able to make it across, even if all the water was gone. But when the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River, they crossed on dry ground because there was an invisible dam. I guess all the kids are over here. No, there's some back there. There was an invisible dam that formed, and the water got stopped, and the rest of the water ran on down, and hundreds of thousands of people and their animals crossed where there was a river just a short time before. And Joshua was directed by God to have 12 strong men, one from each tribe, pick up a big stone out of the middle of the river and build a monument high on the bank, because remember, it was swollen, so they had to get away from the water, and they built a 12-stone monument. Now, our monument probably isn't quite as big, but they are river rock. In fact, they came from, can't remember the name of the park, Daybreak. I picked them out of the river at Daybreak Park yesterday and brought them home. So if anybody needs some rock, yeah, I don't think they need me to put them back. Now, there's another lesson in what we just went through. Little Arya couldn't pick up the bucket, could she? Right, Arya? You couldn't pick up the bucket, so you asked somebody to help you. Now, as we get to be adults, we don't often like to ask for help much. We want to be independent and sufficient and do things on our own. But in this world, there's so many challenges that we can't necessarily do on our own. We have to ask for God's help. And God will help us. So, let's see, yep, we covered that. See, I haven't practiced. So the title, it's not up there. Well, let's see if we can change that. Was it there? Let's see. Okay. Good deal. So the title of the sermon today is Crisis in Egypt. Let's go a couple more. Oh, is it not changing? Is that the deal? Okay. Yep, we're past that. There we go. Crisis in Egypt. You know, after the flood, we know about the Tower of Babel. And at the Tower of Babel, God says, you know, these people are just doing bad things. I need to break them up and disperse them around the world. And I believe that those groups of people took different aspects of technology. And I'll give you an example. The Chinese developed gunpowder, but they didn't have any guns. They didn't have metalworking that they could make guns. But you know, the people around the Roman Empire, they were more metallurgists. So eventually, when they got together, they were able to make guns or cannons, but they had different technologies for the first few hundred years at least. But God split up these people, and there were three main groups initially. There were the Chinese, there were those in India, and the Egyptians. And today, I'm going to focus more on the Egyptians. Now, in this picture, you see some big pyramids. You know, it's hard for us to fathom that they built these things at the very beginning of their empire. It wasn't after they had developed for eons of time. They had the technology and the wherewithal to build these things right at the very beginning. Now, it's also hard for us to comprehend the magnitude of resources that went into building these pyramids. One pyramid, they estimate, you know, and nobody knows for sure, but they estimate 20,000 workers working for 20 years to build one pyramid. Now, what does it take? What does it take to pay 20,000, I mean, even slaves, if you had 20,000 slaves, you got to feed them, you got to keep them healthy enough to do the work for you. Where are you going to get all that food? You know, if you look at Egypt today, it's a desert, very low rainfall. And to think of how they could feed that many people, how to collect taxes from the rest of the people, they'd have to be prosperous enough to collect all the taxes so that you'd have the resources to build these pyramids. And they were done at the very beginning. Now, as the years ticked by, I should say that we know about the story of Joseph. And here we read, when the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said, the famine was in all the lands. It wasn't just Egypt, it was widespread. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. So does it sound like it's just an isolated little place? It's widespread. Now, personally, I believe in the Ice Age, and I was going to share with you a lot of stuff, but I had to cut out at least a half an hour's worth of information. So I'm not going to delve into that. But there was a dramatic change, and I believe it happened at the time of Joseph. Now, as the years ticked by, the government in Egypt got richer and richer through this famine. Because if you wanted grain, you had to buy grain. Well, the people came from other countries and they bought grain. The Egyptians bought grain. But eventually, because they couldn't replenish over the 7 years, they couldn't grow stuff that would mature, they eventually became destitute. In other words, the people of Egypt, sold their cattle, maybe even sometimes their children, to the government so that they could live. Well, the problem with suppressing people that bad is that eventually there's rebellion. Now, when Joseph came to power, Joseph came into Egypt at the time of the Hyksos. Now, has anybody heard of the Hyksos? Yeah, a few people have heard of the Hyksos. They were Semitic people that came from the general Palestine area that had moved down into Egypt. And, because this famine that was severe probably wasn't the first. In fact, Abraham went down to Egypt because there was a famine. So people had gone down to Egypt, and you wonder, well, why is Egypt so different? Why doesn't it experience famine like some of the other places? And if you think about famines, what would constitute a famine in that era? No rain. If you don't have rain, you can't grow your crops, you don't have grasses and things to feed your animals. So without rain, you have a famine. But what's unique about Egypt is it has the Nile River. And the Nile River, I think it's the longest river in the world. And so water would come down the Nile River whether it was rain in Egypt or not. So there was at least some area in Egypt that could still grow things. So the Hyksos were in charge. They had gradually taken over Egypt, and they were in control when Joseph moved down to Egypt. The Bible makes a very short statement. It says in Exodus 1:8, "Now there arose a king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Now, come on. How could that be? I mean, Joseph was like a savior. He not only saved the Egyptian people from starvation, but many other people. I mean, he should have been a famous hero. How can you have a king come into power who doesn't know about Joseph? Well, I believe they chose not to know because he was part of the era of the Hyksos, and the Egyptians wanted to regain. They'd been so oppressed from losing their wealth and being dominated by the Hyksos, they were tired of it. And so they rose up to claim their own country. And the Egyptian that did that, his name is Amos. Is that how you say it? Ahmose? We'll call him a moose. Wanted to erase this part of the Egyptian history. And so he rose to power, and he wanted nothing to do with Joseph, his 12 sons. Not only that, but it was discovered that Joseph's family got some of the choicest agricultural land in the Delta, and they didn't have to pay taxes. So when all the Egyptians were paying for their grain, the family of Jacob, they didn't have to pay for it. They got it free. Well, you can tell that this did not sit well. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country from your family and your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Oh, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So during this time, Jacob's family in Egypt was multiplying. They had plenty of food. They had places to grow stuff in the Delta. They had animals. They had prospered tremendously. And this was a concern for Amos, because he was afraid that the Hebrews would join forces with some other foreign entity and take over Egypt again. So that's when the suppression started. Amos' son, Amenhotep I, joined his father late in Amos' reign, possibly because his father was sick. Amos died in his mid-30s, and Amenhotep I assumed the throne, and he had a son named Thutmose I, who became the next leader of Egypt. But there was a crisis in Egypt. You may ask, well, what kind of crisis? Was it the Hebrews that caused the crisis? Well, not exactly. Thutmose I, who's now the Pharaoh of Egypt, he had a major problem. There were no baby boys being born to the queen. There was a daughter, though, and this daughter is known in history, and her name is Hatshepsut. Eventually, Thutmose I had a son through a concubine, so it's only half a royal child. But Hatshepsut was fully royal, having been born from the king and queen. To remain in power, at one point, the Hatshepsut had to marry her half-brother so that they could keep it in the family line. I'm not an Egyptologist, and I learned this basically from Michael Hazel, who's done his doctorate on Egyptian warfare. Eventually, Thutmose I did have a son through a concubine. His son was called Thutmose II. This son, to retain power, Thutmose II had to marry his half-sister Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was born from the queen and therefore was fully royal, but to keep her family in the line of power, Thutmose I needed a son, but he only got baby girls. Hatshepsut was likely the king's daughter that went down to the Nile River and found baby Moses. You might ask, well, didn't she know that this baby was a Hebrew baby and not an Egyptian? I mean, he wouldn't be Egyptian at all. It's certainly not part of the royal family. But here's the deal. The Nile River was one of their chief gods. And this baby was viewed as a gift from the gods to the royal family. And so we know the story about Moses and how he was supposed to be the next Pharaoh, but we also know how that worked out, and he obviously had to flee because he killed an oppressive Egyptian, so that didn't work out. So what was going to need to happen for this family to remain in power? Well, Queen Hatshepsut's half-brother was now her husband. And Thutmose II was sickly. And his reign only lasted, they don't know exactly, but maybe 2 or 3 years. And then he dies. But before he dies, with his concubine, he has Thutmose III. And the crisis continues. There really is no royal boys to take the throne. And at this time, Thutmose III, born from a concubine and Thutmose II, he was about 3 years old. So what is Queen Hatshepsut going to do? How is she going to maintain power? Well, she begins running as the pharaoh or the monarch of Egypt. But she's a female. And females are not supposed to be pharaohs. So what does she do? She takes on the garb, the clothing, the symbols of the pharaoh, and she puts on a fake beard. And this is a picture of her with a fake beard, so she can sort of legitimately be the queen or the pharaoh of Egypt. Well, eventually, Thutmose III gets older and older, and because he's a guy, even though he's only half royal, he's in line to take over the position of being pharaoh. But Hatshepsut, she's wise, and she puts him in charge of the military. So he becomes the general of the Egyptian's army, and he stays in that role until Hatshepsut dies. But during Hatshepsut's reign as pharaoh, she had a tremendous building program, and this is one of the wonders of the ancient world. It's a mortuary temple built by her and likely by the Hebrew slaves. Because during her reign, she's the one who really oppressed the Hebrews, and they made the bricks that she used in her building program. And just as a side note, have you ever wondered, maybe I'm not your typical person, probably not. But I get fascinated with some of the details and reasons for things. And so it's always puzzled me why they had to put straw in these bricks. Does anyone have any idea why they would put straw in the bricks? If you work in concrete, there are times that they will add fibers. I don't know if they're fiberglass or nylon, but they'll add fibers to mix in with the concrete, so when the concrete does crack a little bit, these fibers hold it together. So yes, the straw was used partially for these bricks to stay together. But another reason is it helped them dry more evenly. And so the moisture could wick out of the mud through the straw. Now, for many years, there were historians that really doubted the Bible. They didn't believe the Bible was accurate because who ever heard of making bricks with straw and mud? I mean, they weren't doing it in other places around the world, but it worked in Egypt because it's so dry. You know, if you did it on the wet side of Peru, you get so much rain that the straw in the bricks would decay and things would fall apart, and it wouldn't last for centuries. But in Egypt, because they're so dry, it wouldn't decay, and it would hold it together and act like these fibers they put in concrete, or you might think of it sort of like rebar. Well, Queen Hatshepsut dies. Thutmose III assumes full control and reigns for 33 years. He expands the kingdom. He expands way up to the Euphrates River and down in North Africa to the Sudan. It was a high time for Egypt because of his campaigns. And they developed pride, and he was worshipped as a god. But we know that God brought the 10 plagues with Moses and Aaron, and Moses and Aaron show up to the Pharaoh's court, and the king isn't going to be intimidated by these humble old people when he is on the top of the world in power and fame. I mean, he's dominating all the way up through Palestine to the Euphrates River. Why should he listen to these two old men? So we know the story, and God, through these plagues, tries to reach the leadership of Egypt and let them know that he is the true God that needs to be worshiped. Let's see, in Exodus 13, let's see, I think it's Exodus, 13, we'll read, when Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Palestine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said, if the people are faced with battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Thus, Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had the sons of Israel swear to do this. He said, God will certainly come to help you. When he does, you must take my bones with you from this place. Now that tells me Joseph didn't take on the religions of the pharaohs. They believed in life after death. I mean, we do too, but they believed in a far different life after death. That's why the beginning pharaohs built these pyramid monuments to prepare them for the life afterwards. Well, Joseph didn't obviously believe in that, so he wanted his bones not put in a temple or in a shrine, but to be taken back to the promised land. Ellen White tells us that there were about 600,000 men that left Egypt with the Exodus. Now, we don't know the exact number, but realistically, there were probably a couple of million when you include the children and the wives. So you have this huge group, couple million people, their flocks and herds. I mean, it's incredible to think what it would take logistically for them to all work together and move from one place to another. What does the Bible say? It says, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Now, did you notice something? Did they stop and camp for the night? It says by day and night. They walked. They hiked. God must have sustained them. When they left Egypt, they continued by day and night, so they didn't have to stop. I mean, think about what it would take to stop and start 2 million people and all their animals. So they just kept going. Across a dreary and desert-like expanse, they journeyed. Already they began to wonder whether their course would lead. By the way, this is in Patriarchs and Prophets. They were becoming weary with the toilsome way, and in some hearts began to arise a fear of pursuit by the Egyptians. But the cloud went before them, and they followed. And now the Lord directed Moses to turn aside into a rocky defile and encamp beside the sea. It was revealed to him that Pharaoh would pursue them, but that God would be honored in their deliverance. Now, this word defile is used as a noun. Does anyone know what that means? Say it again. Yeah, that's what a noun is, a person, place, or thing. But when we use the word defile, we use it as a verb. But if you look up the word defile as a noun, it means a steep-sided, narrow gorge or passage, originally one requiring troops to march in single file. So God directed through this cloud of fire and cloud by day, he directed the children of Israel in this gorge with high rock walls. Interesting. So this is a map that I pulled off of Google Earth early this morning. On the left, in the top corner, you'll see the green area is the delta for the River Nile, the Nile River. And the blue down below, or the top is the Mediterranean Sea, of course, and the two blue strips are fingers of the Red Sea. And the one on the right is called the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, if we zoom in closer on this Gulf of Aqaba, there is a sandy beach, a very large sandy beach. And you can see that twisting ravine that leads to the sandy beach. Now, I believe that during the flood, when the flood occurred and these lands were rising up out of the floodwaters, there was drainage through this defile or gorge, and that's what deposited all this sand on this large beach. Now, if indeed this is a place, and there's debate because everybody seems to have their own opinions, I believe this is accurate based on the information that I've learned over the years and where things are. I believe this is where the Israelites camped. They went through this ravine, and even if they were 50 people wide, how long would it take for 2 million people and all their animals to work their way through a narrow passageway through the rocks to get to this beach? It would take quite a while. So they find themselves here on the beach. And some of the people in the back, you know, they were straggling, I'm sure, potentially all day long to get through this ravine. And the people in the back, in the distance, they can see the glittering reflections off of metal from the approaching Pharaoh's army. They talk to the people ahead of them, and they talk to the people ahead of them, and pretty soon word gets all the way down the chain to this beach where the majority of the people have already arrived that Pharaoh is coming. Now, if you look at this situation, to the north, there's water. To the east there's water, to the south there's water, and if you thought you could escape along the shore, maybe a few people could, but not 2 million people and all their animals. There's just not enough room. It's too rocky. And if Google Earth would get down to ground level and had good pictures, I would have shown you that. But this part of the world, we don't have as much access to. So they were trapped because behind them was Pharaoh's army coming up this gorge. What are they going to do? They start to panic. They get after Moses. You brought us out here to die. I mean, wouldn't you panic? There's no way out. But this reminds us of our text. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles. As Christians, when we're in a tough spot and we can't see any way out, there's no need to panic. Because God has a way for you to escape or to solve your problem. And I'm not just telling you, I'm pointing the finger back at me. I got to be reminded of this because I've gone through some rough times. And, prior to my vacation, I wasn't getting hardly any work. And so I was thinking, boy, I'll have lots of time to work on this sermon. So I come back from vacation and they slam me. So that's why I was working till almost 9 o'clock this morning trying to put it together. So let's go back to the Bible. In Exodus 14, it says, Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on the right hand and on the left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. We all know the story, but let's look at the next few texts. Continuing, it says, Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians, and he took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. Kind of hard to drive a chariot without a wheel. And the Egyptians said, Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Continuing on. Then the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand over the sea, and the waters may come back upon the Egyptians on their chariots and on their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on the right hand and on the left. Wow, we know the story. But I want you to go back to verse 24. What does it say in verse 24? Now it came to pass in the morning watch. That gives us a clue. You know what happened is when the children of Israel were on that big beach, God made it so dark on the backside, behind them, that Pharaoh's army couldn't advance. Now, some might say, well, they didn't walk night and day. Why would you need a pillar of fire by night? You'd have night lights, the stars, and the moon. So you could have some light. You didn't need a big pillar unless you were advancing and hiking and walking. So I believe they did night and day. They get to the beach and it's at the end of the day. God makes it dark for the Egyptians and he makes it light for the Israelites. He parts the sea at the end of the day and they spend all night hiking across. Now think about that. What would you think if you were on the beach at nighttime, and yes, you've got this big pillar of fire, but it's over 10 miles across the Gulf of Aqaba to the other side, and you see these big walls, and it's nighttime everywhere else? Would you venture out into that? Boy, that would take some faith. But remember the verse. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles. You know, we face, occasionally, some of us at least, face situations where we have no hope. The waters above us, the waters below us, the waters beside us, the mountains and the army is behind us. What are we going to do? We can lean on God. And unfortunately, God doesn't usually do things in advance. He waits till the last minute. It causes me grief sometimes. But God comes through, and God will save you. So as you take on the next week, the next month, the next year, and you face trials, remember what God did for the children of Israel. When they were in a mess, He came through and delivered them. You know, and it was a major blow. Egypt was at the height of its glory, and He wiped them out with the plagues. He wiped out their army. They were humbled. And don't you think the rest of the nations around heard about this and knew what happened? God was trying to tell them, hey, I am the God of the universe, and I call the shots. Yeah. Debbie and I went on vacation the last week, and basically it was about 10 days. And we got to visit, on the way back, we got to visit two sites, William Miller's farm and Hiram Edson's farm. And, you know, those pioneers were looking forward to the second coming of Jesus on October 22, 1844. They had a dark time after that. But one of their favorite hymns was number 448. So as we close today, let's sing number 448, Oh, When Will I See Jesus?
If you'd like to stand with us. Where is it? 448.
Most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for being there for us, for getting us out of messes that we don't really deserve. Lord, we ask for your encouragement, your strength as we face the trials of this life so that we can enjoy eternity with you is our prayer in Jesus' name.